3 sheriff cars were sitting on my grass, with their lights spinning. Slow, my dock was packed with about 50 neighbors, holding paper plates and hot dogs. Like this was some church picnic. And right in the middle of it all, our HOA president, Genevieve Stanton, was yelling at a deputy that he had no right to shut down her community. Lake Day, the crazy part was it wasn't her lake, it was mine, every inch of it. And the stack of papers in that deputy's hand said so in bold black ink. He raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear and said, "Ma'am, this lake is private property. It sits entirely inside Mr. Whitmore's deeded land. Right now, you and everyone you invited are trespassing, and you could feel the air change." You know what I mean? That quiet moment when people realize they might be on the wrong side of the story. Then, the second deputy stepped up with another folder and told her the district attorney had some questions about $75,000 in HOA money that had gone missing into legal fees and a phony lake maintenance company. And Genevieve turned and looked at me like she was just now understanding that the quiet guy with the red kayak had been taking notes the whole time that moment on my dock, with sirens flashing on the water and TV cameras rolling, did not happen by accident. It was the final move in a game she started 6 months earlier when she stood on this same dock and told me my family. Lake belonged to the community now. My name is Graham Whitmore. I used to be an insurance fraud investigator, and I thought I retired to this cabin to escape drama. Instead, I ended up running the most satisfying case of my life against an HOA president who thought bylaws were stronger than the law. When I first came back to Mountain View Estates, I wasn't looking for a fight at all. I was looking for quiet. I had spent 18 years picking apart fake injuries, staged accidents, people swearing they couldn't lift a box on Monday, and then posting dirt bike videos on Tuesday. After a while, that kind of work corrodes you from the inside. You start assuming everyone's lying, even when they're not. So when my grandfather's cabin came through in the inheritance, 3 acres of pine trees wrapped around a 1-acre lake, a little wooden dock, a red kayak tied to a cleat. Just like I remembered from childhood summers, it felt like a doorway out of all that noise. The deed dated back to 1965, before the HOA even existed. The survey map showed the lake sitting completely inside our boundary lines, like a blue coin dropped in the middle of our land. No shared shoreline, no easements, no nothing is ours. I sold my condo, packed up my life, and drove 6 hours north, telling myself that for the first time in 20 years, I could just drink my coffee and listen to birds without wondering who was scamming who. The HOA welcome packet was waiting in the mailbox when I arrived. Thick envelope logo with mountains and a stylized lake inside was a stack of rules that looked pretty standard at first glance. Paint colors, fence, heights, lawn care, trash cans, the kind of stuff you roll your eyes at. But live with my cabin was at the far edge of the development, surrounded by woods. No shared parks or pools anywhere near me. So I flipped through the binder, shrugged, and figured none of this would really touch me out here. I was wrong, and I should have known better. The red flags were all there. I just really wanted a break. On my second morning, 9:30 on the dot, the first red flag rolled right up my gravel drive in the form of a white golf cart. I was on the dock with my coffee, watching the mist burn off the water, when I heard the crunch of tires and turned around, and there she was. Genevieve Stanton, HOA president, dressed in a pale yellow blazer that probably cost more than my kayak hair. Curled sunglasses perched on her head like a crown clutching a binder that looked suspiciously familiar. She smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes, and said, "You must be Pa Whitmore." Welcome to Mountain View Estates. I wanted to personally deliver our community guidelines. We like to keep standards very clear. She handed me the binder 2 inches thick. I flipped it open, saw pages of diagrams for approved mailbox designs, charts of paint colors with names like sandstone mist and heritage taupe, even rules for acceptable window coverings. I said something neutral, like, "This is comprehensive," and let her talk old habits. While she was rambling about protecting property values, her eyes drifted past my shoulder, locked onto the dock, and I watched the smile tighten when she saw the kayak, bright red against the dark water. Same one my grandfather helped me pick out when I was 16. "I see you have a kayak," she said, voice sugar sweet, but with an edge underneath. "That's lovely. We do have color guidelines for watercraft, though we try to maintain a neutral palette. That red is a bit loud." I turned, looked at the kayak, looked back at her, and said, "It's on my private lake. The lake's entirely inside my property line. The deed predates the HOA. She gave a light little laugh like I was confused. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Mer Whitmore. All water features in Mountain View fall under HOA jurisdiction. We updated our shared resource policy in 2020. It's in Section 7. I'd recommend repainting it to an approved color before we have to start issuing violations." Something cold settled in my stomach right then. Not fear, just recognition. I had seen this posture so many times across a conference table, the person who assumes authority. "They don't actually have waiting to see if you'll flinch," I said. "I'll look at the paperwork and let her drive off in her little golf cart binder delivered." Victory assumed. That night, I sat at the cabin table with 2 stacks of paper. The HOA Bylaws and my grandfather's deed Section 7 was full of vague phrases like shared visual landscape and collective resources, written in a way that could mean anything. If the wrong person was in charge, it never explicitly mentioned X, never mentioned my lot number, but it was loose enough to be stretched there. The deed, on the other hand, was precise bearings. Distance's notes about exclusive use of water fully enclosed within parcel boundaries. I snapped photos of both, plus the original survey map, and dropped them into a folder on my laptop called HOA Documentation. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it yet, but 16 years of investigations had taught me one thing: start documenting early. You'll be glad later. The first real collision happened at the community meeting Thursday night. Little hall that smelled like old coffee and lemon cleaner. About 15 households scattered across metal folding chairs. Most people in the back, heads down, trying not to draw attention at the front. Genevieve sat behind a table with 3 other board members flanking her, like backup singers, all pastels and tight smiles. She worked through the agenda like a judge reading out sentences. One by one, she called out violations. The Bennetts planted the wrong shade of flowers. The Hoffmans left trash cans visible for 3 hours. Past pickup, somebody's grass was 7 inches instead of 6. Each time the room stayed quiet. People shifted, stared at the floor, huddled. It felt less like a meeting and more like a performance of control. About 20 minutes in, I slipped into a chair in the 3rd row. She clocked me instantly, and her whole energy sharpened. "Oh, wonderful, Miss Whitmore is here," she said into the microphone. "I was just about to bring up your property." You could hear the little sizzle in the air, everyone suddenly very interested and very scared at the same time. She didn't even look at her notes. "As I mentioned during my welcome visit, your bright red kayak presents a significant aesthetic concern. It violates our approved color palette for watercraft, and several neighbors have expressed worries about how it will affect property values. That was a lie. I could see it in their faces. Nobody looked worried about the kayak. They looked worried about being the next name on that list. I said, keeping my voice level, "The kayak is on a private lake entirely within my deeded property. The lake predates this HOA by decades. Section 7 doesn't override that." Genevieve turned the full beam of her condescension on me. "Property law evolves, Mr. Whitmore. Our shared resource bylaw clearly establishes community oversight of features like your lake. If you're unsure, you're certainly welcome to consult an attorney. Of course, HOA legal challenges can be very expensive. We have a substantial legal fund contributed by all residents. Cases like that can drag on for years. Is the color of a kayak really worth all that stress?" That last line was the real message. The rules weren't the weapon. Exhaustion was make resistance sound expensive enough, and people will police themselves. I had seen that tactic 1,000 times on the other side of my old job. I just nodded and said, "I'll consider my options." And she smiled like she'd already won. After the meeting, an older man caught me in the parking lot. Thin guy, carpenter's hands. 12 years of wear on his face. He glanced back at the hall like he was afraid she'd appear behind him. "Name's Wallace," he said. "Listen, I'm telling you this. As a neighbor, you can't win against Genevieve. There was a family here last year. The Kensingtons, she buried them in fines until they sold and left. She's got the mayor's cousin on speed dial, half the town council at her Christmas parties. If you push, she pushes harder. My advice, repaint the kayak and stay off her radar." I drove back to the cabin that night with that sick feeling in my chest. The one you get when someone hands you a choice. That's not really a choice. Repaint, and tell her she gets to redefine your property rights, or refuse and invite a war you didn't ask for. I sat on the dock with the red kayak rocking against the posts, thinking about my grandfather's voice saying, "Owning land means you get to exist somewhere without asking permission." And I realized I was already being asked in the most aggressive, polite way possible. The first fine showed up a few days later. $500 for non-compliant watercraft color, printed on official letterhead, with a violation number and a signature. It looked like something that belonged in a court file, but it was just ink and intimidation. I scanned it and dropped it into the documentation folder. The kayak stayed red. Another letter came 2 weeks later. This time, $1,200, and a whole paragraph in bold about liens and possible foreclosure proceedings. Anyone who hadn't spent years swimming in paperwork like this might have panicked. I just took a photo, filed it, and sent one email back. "Please provide the specific statute that gives the HOA authority over pre-existing private properties like my lake." She didn't answer. Instead, something more subtle started happening. People's eyes changed to the woman at the mailboxes who had smiled and waved. My first week suddenly turned away. A couple walking their dog. Crossed the street when they saw me coming. The clerk at the small grocery store went from chatty to clipped overnight. It took a few days before a younger neighbor stopped his car by mine at the gate and said, "Hey man, you on Facebook. You should see what Genevieve posted." He showed me the community group on his phone post from Genevieve in that same syrupy tone. "Neighbors, I hate to say this, but our new resident on Lakeview Drive has refused basic community standards, despite multiple attempts to resolve things kindly. His unwillingness to make small compromises raises questions about whether he respects our shared values." The comments were brutal in that passive HOA way. Most people just liked it. A few chimed in about bad fits and people who should move somewhere without rules. A couple defended me, but their comments got buried. My entire reputation in this place I had just moved to had been pre-written by a woman in a yellow blazer with a Facebook login. That was the point where the hurt flipped into something harder. If you've ever been lied about publicly, you know the feeling like being shoved back into a version of yourself you thought you'd left behind. I could have packed up, sold the cabin, walked away. But this lake wasn't just water. It was 30 summers of my life, and one of the last things my grandfather left me. And underneath the hurt, there was this stubborn, tired part of me that said, "No, not this time." So I did the one thing I actually know how to do. I built a case. I installed small cameras overlooking the dock and the path from the road. Nothing obvious, just enough to capture faces. Plates audio. Each morning I drank my coffee and scrolled through the last 24 hours of footage, marking down every car that slowed, every person who took photos, every step over the property line. Within a couple of weeks, I had dozens of clips of board members and their friends photographing my lake like they were cataloging evidence for their own files. Then the trespassing started. One Saturday, I woke up to voices and laughter outside, looked out the window, and saw Genevieve on my dock with 3 people and a folding table. They had a cooler lawn chairs. Somebody was taking pictures. I walked down in a t-shirt and jeans and said, "Morning. You're on private property." She didn't even pause. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. We're just enjoying the community HOA section. Gives all residents access to shared resources. You're welcome to join us. Community participation is important." I could feel my pulse in my ears. She wanted me to blow up, to yell, to give her a scene she could twist into. Aggressive neighbor harasses peaceful residents. I saw one of the men glance at a phone on the table that was angled perfectly toward me. That was the moment I made the choice that probably saved this whole thing. I forced myself to smile and said, "Enjoy your afternoon," then turned and walked back up to the cabin. Inside, the quiet clicking of my cameras was already doing the work for me. That day pushed me from annoyed into, "This is criminal now." She wasn't just abusing bylaws. She was openly asserting ownership of land she knew wasn't hers, and bringing witnesses to rehearse the script I kept documenting. But I also started looking where people like her never expect you to look. The money I sent a formal written request as a dues-paying member for 3 years of HOA financial records. Not summaries, real records, bank statements, invoices, canceled checks. What I got back first was 2 pages of sanitized numbers, a big line called legal expenses, and another called lake maintenance. When I pushed for full documentation, a lawyer emailed me saying my excessive requests could be considered harassment. I replied with 1 sentence, quoting the state statute that says, "HOA members have broad rights to inspect financials." 2 weeks later, a box of paper landed on my porch, messy, disorganized, clearly designed to make any normal person give up out of sheer frustration. They forgot I used to live inside this kind of mess. I spent 3 days scanning running OCR, building a searchable spreadsheet, and patterns popped right out. In 2 years, they had paid about $75,000 in legal fees to a small law office 3 towns over. But meeting minutes only mentioned maybe $10,000 approved by vote. Then there was lake maintenance, $10,000 to a company called Aquatech Solutions. No website, no phone listing, nothing. A quick business registry search showed Aquatech was a brand new LLC, registered to a P.O. box, and owned by someone with the same last name as one of Genevieve's loyal board members. You don't have to be an investigator to see what that looks like, but it helps. At the same time, I hired a surveyor to reshoot my property line with modern equipment. 2 days of measuring photos and records later, He handed me a report that said in plain language what I already knew in my gut. My property extended past the far bank of the lake. Every square foot of water sat entirely within my boundaries. He signed an affidavit, and I notarized it between that the deed, the video, and the financials. I had more than enough to go nuclear. I just needed her to overreach in a way nobody could spin. So I sent one more email. This one, sounding almost conciliatory. I told Genevieve I was considering allowing limited community access to the lake under certain conditions, and asked if she'd be willing to discuss terms. It was bait, and she bit like a hungry fish. I appreciate your willingness to finally be reasonable, she wrote back. However, the community does not need your permission to access what already belongs to us under established covenants. I will continue managing the lake as I see fit. I read that line 3 times, dragged the email into my evidence folder, and knew exactly what was coming next. She went public full throttle. She posted photos of my dock in the HOA group with captions like, "So excited to make better use of our beautiful community lake this summer." She set up a sign-up sheet so families could reserve time slots on my water, and people started showing up, a family with 3 kids and a pile of inflatables. A retired couple who moved my kayak without asking a group of teenagers who turned the dock into their late-night party spot, and snapped a railing board. Every visit was recorded, filed, and quietly added to a timeline. I was building, then she made her biggest mistake. She called the newspaper. A week before her big Community Lake Day, there was a story on the front page about how Mountain View Estates had turned its private lake into an inclusive shared space photo of Genevieve on my dock, with her arms spread like she was presenting a gift, quotes about shared values and bringing people together. Not a single mention of the deed, the survey, or the concept of private property. That story got clipped and taped on my fridge next to a copy of the deed, and I started making phone calls for real. I filed a trespass report with the county sheriff, attached sample clips and stills. I sent a packet to the district attorney's office laying out the misuse of HOA funds. The shell company, the threats of foreclosure over a kayak color. I submitted a complaint to the state agency that regulates HOAs, pointing out how Section 7 had been slipped through at a nearly empty meeting and was now being used to justify criminal behavior. And I sat down with a property rights attorney, handed him a thumb drive, and told him I wanted a restraining order, a civil suit, and I wanted them ready to file. The morning of Community Lake Day, my inbox pinged with one last gem from Genevieve. Any interference with today's event will result in immediate legal action, including fines, liens, and possible foreclosure. I suggest you use this day to reflect on whether you really belong in this community. I actually laughed out loud, saved the email, and called my attorney. File everything. I said right now. By 10 a.m., my quiet 3 acres looked like a park, cars lining the road. Kids running across my grass with towels. Someone setting up a portable sound system, 2 local news vans by the entrance. Genevieve down on the dock in white linen, directing everyone like a wedding planner. I watched from the window for a while. Then I got in my truck, drove into town to sign the last page of paperwork. And when I came back, the sheriffs were already there, lights reflecting off the water. The scene you heard at the start played out pretty much exactly like that. The deputy reading the restraining order, telling Genevieve and the entire crowd that the lake was private property, that they were trespassing, telling them to clear out, her losing that smooth tone, and shouting about how she was the HOA president and had full authority over community resources. The investigator stepping in to tell her they had some questions about $75,000 in unexplained legal expenses and $10,000 paid to a shell company registered to her ally's family. the board members' faces draining of color as they realized they might be standing inside a crime scene. Neighbors whispering, "Did she steal from us? And is that where our dues went?" Genevieve pointing at me and screaming, "You set me up. You think you won. You have no idea who you're dealing with." And me finally saying one simple thing, calm, because there was nothing left to argue about. "I didn't set you up, Genevieve. I just kept every receipt." They walked her off my property with cameras rolling and half the neighborhood watching. And I'd love to tell you I felt nothing but satisfaction, but if I'm honest, once the adrenaline wore off, mostly, I just felt tired. Tired. That it took 6 months of constant documentation and a background and investigation to stop one person with a clipboard from rewriting reality. Tired that 3 families before me had just sold and left, because fighting back cost too much. Tired that in our system, justice doesn't show up on its own. You have to chase it, fund it, and prove it, line by line. In the months after things played out pretty much how you'd expect, the DA filed charges. Genevieve took a plea on a reduced embezzlement count and an extortion charge tied to her foreclosure threats. The civil court agreed my lake was private, voided all the fines, and hit her with damages and legal fees big enough that she had to sell her house. She's banned from serving on any HOA board in the state for 10 years. The old board resigned, Wallace. The man who warned me in the parking lot ended up elected president. He repealed Section 7 at the first meeting and pushed through actual transparency rules. Financials online. Minutes posted within 48 hours. That kind of thing. My red kayak is still tied to the dock, just as bright as the day this started. I'd like to say I went right back to being the peaceful lake guy after that. But the truth is something changed in me. I still sit on the dock with coffee in the mornings. I still listen to the birds and watch the mist rise. But I also still have cameras running backed up to 3 places. The documentation folder is still on my laptop, and a part of me is always listening for the sound of another metaphorical golf cart coming down the drive. Maybe that's paranoia, or maybe it's just what happens when you stare long enough at the way power gets abused in small places. So I'm curious what you think. Was I right to push it this far, to turn a simple HOA dispute into restraining orders, criminal investigations, and someone losing their position and their house? Or did I go too far? Should I have repainted? The kayak swallowed the principle and kept my peace. What would you have done if someone stood on your dock and announced your family's lake belongs to the community now, if you've dealt with an HOA? Karen, a petty boss, a neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to them. I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments if this feels like justice to you or just revenge. With better paperwork, share your own stories, and if you know someone who's stuck in their own HOA nightmare, send this to them. Sometimes the quiet guy with the red kayak wins, but only if he writes everything down.